Matisse Snyder. Chapter 17. Sacrifices must be made.
Derek Riggs, upstate Massachusetts, 1996. The sound of a billowing storm lingered above the distant cries of our names, echoing through the forest in the dead of night. My hand remained pressed over Matthew's mouth, desperately trying to keep him from crying out for help or revealing the location of our secret fort. Sebastian lay unconscious on the ground mat, sleeping his head wound away until the morning came and we could help him back into town. But for that moment, twitching my eyes in the darkness, trying to decipher the sounds, the only thing on my mind was self-preservation, of keeping the fort secret and finding out who in the hell had made it this far into the forest looking for us. I pulled my hand slowly away from Matthew's mouth and leaned towards his ear to whisper something to him. "Don't make a sound. Do you understand me?" "I'm scared," he responded, keeping his voice low enough that I didn't need to silence him again. He clutched tightly onto my shirt, trying to make himself feel safer. "It's okay, Matt. Just relax." "I don't like the dark, Derek. Turn the light back on," he exclaimed, his voice beginning to rise along with his uncertainty and fear. My ears twitched to the distant call of our names once more, and I considered what to do. I took Matthew's fearful hands in mine and slid a small flashlight into them. "Here, you can hold this, but I need you to promise me something, okay?" "What?" "Do not shine it at the entrance to the fort. It could give away our position, understand?" Matthew ignored my statement and turned on the flashlight to reveal his petrified expression. I tilted the light down to his lap and away from the entrance. "God damn it, Matthew," I hissed, moving myself in between the light and the exit. "Keep your shit together. They cannot find this place. Do you fucking get me?" I continued, clutching his arm tightly. The kid looked like he was about to piss himself, he was so afraid. I lowered my tone and forced myself to be nicer. "Please, just stay calm and don't move, okay? We don't know who's out there, but I'm gonna go look, okay?" "Don't leave me alone, Derek, please," he cried, grabbing onto my shirt again and pulling me towards him. I clenched my jaw in frustration, treating this kid's emotions like defusing a bomb. "You're not alone. Your brother's here, and I'll be just outside," I explained, taking off my jacket so that it wouldn't rustle as I moved. Matthew began to cry, unable to cope with all that had happened and the possibility of more to come. I placed my hands on his shoulders to try and comfort him, bringing his eyes up to meet mine. "Look, Matt, there's nothing to be afraid of. You know why?" He shook his head, wiping away tears with his jacket sleeve. "Because you're stronger than you realize. Because you're capable of more than you've ever imagined. I believe in you, Matt. I wouldn't have brought you here if I didn't. You're my friend now. And more importantly than that, you're a part of our team. Be strong, Matt. I know you can," I finished, unaccustomed to giving pep talks. Matthew's expression seemed to relax just enough that I was able to lower my hands from his shoulders and trust him to keep from losing his cool. He stopped crying and nodded his head, accepting that he couldn't escape from the situation and that crying about it would only make it worse. I smiled, proud of the kid for manning up when the time came.
"Boys, Derek, Matthew, Sebastian!"
The voices cried out, closer than before. I raised a finger in front of my mouth, reminding Matthew to be quiet. He nodded, tightly gripping the flashlight, and I slunk towards the tarp slung over the exit, peeling it aside to reveal the slight trickle of rainfall upon the branches clustered together. I slid my body through the camouflaged, fallen trees leading into the fort, making absolutely sure to remain completely silent. As I emerged from the tangled cluster of trees, poking my head beyond the slope of the hill the fort had been dug into, I spotted dots of light combing through the woods. Flashlights held by unknown figures stepped in all directions, leading me to believe that whoever had come looking for us had gotten lucky wandering this close to the fort. I moved cleanly past a nearby stream, leapfrogging rocks and scurrying up a short hill to get a better view. Our names were called out again and again as each bellow found its way to my ears. I nervously checked the entrance to the fort to see if Matthew would emerge or shine a light, giving away our position. Nothing. Good. I crouched low to the ground, stepping from tree to tree for cover as I moved closer to the lights. And though the pitch black of the forest kept me from identifying the intruders, I knew my way around the area so well that carving a path to them was as easy as it would have been in broad daylight. The rain picked up and began to fall more heavily from the few leaves remaining on the trees, soaking into those on the ground and removing their crisp sound. My feet moved freely, and my eyes peered through the darkness with comfort and confidence. I was a hunter, and they were my prey. But as I approached them from their blind sides, a quick flick of a flashlight in my direction spread across the forest and forced me to duck behind a tree. I pressed my back to the bark and held my breath, cursing to myself as the light continued to flood over the area I hid in, but worse still, in the direction of the fort. I slid my cheek along the trunk of the dark side of the tree, peering out of the corner of my eye as I finally caught a glimpse of who was looking for us. The police. 3 of them in total, all of whom I recognized from previous scare tactics and encounters from my alleged delinquent behavior.
Boys, are you out here?
One of the cops shouted, walking past the tree I stood behind as he moved closer and closer to the entrance of the fort. My heart beat faster, knowing now that unless they found us or had a reason to turn back around, they'd soon be on top of where Sebastian and Matthew were hiding. And while I had complete confidence in how well the entranceway had been concealed, I still didn't know if I could trust Matthew. I had no choice. It was either act now or be helpless later. I stepped out from behind the tree, staring at the backs of the police, and raised my hands to my mouth, whistling to draw their attention. "Hey!" I shouted, watching as the cops turned sharply around, shining their flashlights on me. I turned, faced away from the fort, and pushed my heels off the muddy ground to make my getaway. I could hear the sounds of the police pursuing me. The light from the officers' flashlights bounced up and down, giving me fleeting glimpses of the forest ahead. I ran hard and fast, weaving in between trees and their bulbous roots with the skill of a deer. And while I knew I'd be able to outrun the cops forever, my plan wasn't as simple as getting away. I didn't know how they'd managed to come so close to our fort or what exactly had motivated them. I didn't know if Sebastian's parents had sent them because their little angel Matthew had gone missing this time too, or if my parents had sent them to find and lock me away again. But the one thing I did know was that they were trespassing on my territory, and I wouldn't stop running until I'd taken them away from it.
"Derek, stop!"
One of the officers shouted, already out of breath and falling behind. "Why are you chasing me?" I replied, turning my head around to gauge their distance like fish on the line.
"Derek, you're not in trouble. We just need to talk to you."
"Are you kidding?" I yelled, still breathing well enough to laugh. "Do you even remember the last time we did this?" I continued, referring to one of my many previous encounters with local authorities. "You threw me in a cell with no evidence, and then you lied to my parents about it," I finished, getting a repressed flash of one of the worst beatings I'd ever had from my parents. However, as my thought came to an end, I noticed my pursuer's footsteps were no longer behind me. I stopped and turned around to see the 3 officers propping themselves up with their hands against their knees, gasping for breath and shaking their heads. I grinned condescendingly, amused by their fat asses and how unaccustomed they were to moving them. What do you guys want anyway?
We don't give a shit about you, Derek.
Nobody does, one of them replied, standing upright again and shaking his head.
We're not out here to play fucking games. We're looking for the Simmons kids.
What for?
We don't have time for this. If you know where they are, we need to know.
What for? I repeated, about as fond of cops as I was of ghouls. They adjusted their posture, tempted to try and catch me and slap an answer out of me. But instead, they adjusted their posture, tempted to try and catch me and slap an answer out of me. But instead, they only shook their heads, knowing that they'd get their chance another time.
Their mother's in the hospital,
one of the cops snapped, getting about as angry as he'd been the time I had tried to break into the police station.
She's probably gonna die, you little shit. And all she wants is to see her kids again. Now, unless you want us to convince your parents to beat your fucking skull in for good this time, why not try being a decent human being for a change and tell us where they are?
I swallowed hard and clenched my jaw, staring sternly at the officer's face to try and decipher whether or not he was lying. But as I looked at his disgusted and furious expression, I realized he was telling the truth. Suddenly, my head jumped from the situation I was in to the protocols Sebastian and I had established in case of danger or infection. Because while there were extenuating circumstances put in place to allow for family care and compassion, they did not allow for family to be prioritized above security. And as much as I wanted to accommodate the emergency, I couldn't do it without jeopardizing the fort. Because of his head wound, Sebastian couldn't move or be moved without help, and because his brother, Matthew, didn't know the protocols yet, he couldn't understand the full severity of the situation. He couldn't be trusted to react rationally, not emotionally. He was a kid, after all. We all were. Which is precisely why we had to stop ourselves from behaving like children. There was no decision to make. Sebastian would understand, and Matthew wouldn't. It was clear that neither of them could know the decision I was about to make until the next morning, if ever. They left about an hour ago, before I came out here, I said, accustomed to lying to the police and pretending to be sincere. They told me they were going home, but they might have stopped by the arcade first. Matthew was whining about wanting to play video games all day, I explained, feeling worse than I thought I could. It was the hardest decision I'd ever had to make. It was real. For the first time, the sacrifices we'd have to make for the plan and the security we'd have to enact for the fort were real. The cops stared sternly at me, clearly believing what I said, despite the fact it wasn't what they wanted to hear.
All right. Which arcade?
The one on Delancey.
Okay. Thanks.
What happened to her? I asked, needing to know.
She was hit by a car.
And, you're sure she's going to die? I asked, worried about my friend's mother. She'd always been nice to me. She never asked questions when I slept over without asking, or showed up at their house in the middle of the night.
We don't know.
He stated, acting like he wasn't wearing his badge for a change. We all waited for a half a second before anyone spoke again, standing on common ground for the first time.
Look, Derek, it'd help us if you came with us. If the boys aren't where they say they are, we might be able to ask you some more questions. Would you consider coming to help?
One of the officers tried to suggest, stepping towards me and abusing the trust I'd given them. No, I interrupted, moving away from them with each subtle gesture they made in my direction. I told you everything I know, but I can't go home tonight, I continued, knowing they'd understand the troubled relationship I had with my parents. They stopped moving and let me have my space.
We won't take you home. You can come to the hospital if you want,
one of the officers suggested, either talking about letting me see Mrs. Simmons while she was still alive, or just now noticing the gash on my forehead. And while I wanted to go with them and take back every lie I just told them, instead I shook my head and backed away. Sorry for running before, but don't chase me this time, I exclaimed, turning once more to make my escape, disappearing into the woods. This time, I didn't hear footsteps slopping behind me in the mud or see bursts of light from flashlights and pursuits. This time, I was alone and free to run, vanishing into the darkness as I quickly navigated the woods. The cops had already turned back, headed where I'd told them to look, while, unbeknownst to them, I circled around them in the direction of the fort. But as I pumped my arms and legs, running hard and fast, the rain fell heavy on my shoulders, and my breaths came short. I slowed my steps, unable to run any longer, coming to realize that it wasn't just the rain striking my face. I was crying. Tears ran down my cheeks as I released gasps for air. I stopped and leaned against a tree, trying to pull my shit together before I had to face my friends again, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't get the thought of Mrs. Simmons out of my head, just lying in a hospital bed, asking for her kids. And there I was, Mr. Fucking Know-It-All, telling her she couldn't have her dying wish. I'd never felt worse in my whole life. I just fucking stood there, crying like a baby, reminding myself over and over that these were the kind of sacrifices that had to be made. When I finally returned to the fort, able to keep from crying and pretend like nothing had happened, I was happy to see that there weren't any lights or abnormalities that would give away our position. Matthew had listened to me. He'd kept his wits about him and his head on his shoulders, despite the fear he'd felt and the burden of his wounded brother at his side. He'd trusted me enough to stay hidden and had waited patiently for my return. I took a satisfied breath and let some of the stress of the evening unravel. I slid carefully in between branches and peeled the protective tarp, hearing the slight rustling of Matthew's jacket as I moved into the darkness. "Matt, how you doing?" I whispered, stepping over the part of the ground that I knew Sebastian lay unconscious on.
Can I turn the light on now?
Sure, go ahead, I replied, as a beam of light struck me in the face halfway through giving Matt permission to turn his flashlight on. I squinted and lowered myself to the ground to sit beside him. He looked at me with uncertainty. His eyes were still pink from crying, but his cheeks were dry. I mustered a smile, swallowing the guilt tearing me up inside, and he smiled back.
Who was out there?
I don't know, I lied, reaching for a towel to dry myself off before I try to fall asleep. But they're gone now, and everything's gonna be okay. Okay?